So today we are going over a couple more steps of our lined dress. So today we're going to attach the neckline for the shell to the facing, and then same for the armhole, just like we did on our all-in-one facing sample for our notebook. So let's go ahead and switch over and we'll get started. Okay, so I've got my full shell here. So this is the outside of the dress. And then I've got my full lining and facing layer ready to go together. So the first thing we're going to do is stitch them together at the neckline. So in order to do that on my shell, I need to unzip my zipper. And that'll just make it a little bit easier to get in here and stitch this neckline. And then once I have my zipper unzipped, I'm going to match these up right sides together. So I'm looking at the right side of my shell right here. And then I'm going to take my facing layer and open that one up. So we don't have a zipper at center back for that one. So I can just open it up without having to unzip it. And we're just going to place those two right sides together. And so I'm going to start pinning. I like to start with my seams. This is my shoulder seam. It should match up to the shoulder seam on the other piece. I'm going to pin those together. For the center back, whenever we do that area, we need to make sure that our zipper is sticking off the edge. So right now we've pressed it like this to where just the teeth are sticking off the edge. But in order to attach these together, we're going to let this stick off completely. So that instead of having that seam allowance folded back towards the inside, I'm going to let it stick off the edge just like this. And then I can put my facing right sides together, and that way it matches all the way to the edge. So I'm going to match up that corner right there. And then I'll put a pin in between those areas. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. I like to come and do the middle last. So again, shoulder seam right on top of each other here. Let that zipper stick off the edge. I'm going to trim off this little thread too. But let that zipper stick off the edge and then put it right sides together with my facing layer. Okay, and then coming to the middle, for this one, it happens to be a V-neck. So we have this point at our V where they're going to match up. You could, this could be on any sort of neckline. So you could just have a regular curve. You could have like a square, but those two should be the exact same from your facing to your shell, should be the exact same. So we're just matching them up and pinning them together. So I'm going to match up that little V and pin that. And then just work my way out to my shoulder where we started. There we go. Same on this side. Okay, now we're ready to go stitch those two necklines together at 1/4 inch. So this will be considered an enclosed seam for our facing neckline area and armhole area. These are 1/4 inch seam allowances. Okay, over here, I'm just going to start at one of my center backs and work my way around to that other center back. I'm using that 1/4 inch marking on my foot to line up the edge of my fabric. And then we'll just stitch it with a basic 2.5 stitch. And for this one, as you go over the zipper area where those teeth are, we don't have to worry this time about hitting that metal stop because invisible zippers typically just have a plastic stop and our needle can go through that. So I'm just gonna go ahead and sew. I may have to help it through a little bit because it wants to get stuck. There we go. But your needle should go right over, even if it were to hit that plastic part, it shouldn't stop the needle. It should go right over and just either skip over it itself or pierce through the plastic. Okay, and I'm just following this neckline all the way around, making sure that my edges do not get uneven here at the right. If they do, it's more likely that you'll accidentally have frayed edges sticking out of your neckline at the end. So make sure that those stay nice and even on the right-hand side. See, mine are a little uneven right here. I'm going to pull that bottom one back to help even it back up. Okay, when I get to the V point, we're gonna have to turn the corner just like we do a 90-degree angle. So I'm gonna go down until I hit that center of the V, and then I'm going to pivot so I can go up the other side. I didn't go quite far enough. So I can see when I turn here, my 1/4 inch is not in line with that edge. There's a discrepancy. It's only about 1/8 of an inch away from my needle. So I know I didn't go quite far enough. So I'm gonna come back over here and go 1 or 2 more stitches. There we go. Now we'll try it again. There we go. So now when I pivot, let's see if I can use a pin. This is my 1/4 inch marking right here, and my fabric is in line with that. So I know I've gone far enough. Make sure as you go over those seams that they're still busted open. Okay. Let's head back to our ironing board. Okay, so now we're over here. I'm gonna trim up any thread tails that I may have. And then the next thing we need to do is trim and clip this neckline before we can press it. So I'm gonna turn this upside down just because I find it easier to work from this angle. I'm going to start on one of my center back seams where my zipper is, and I'm going to start trimming that facing seam allowance in half. And when I do that, I'll also trim this little tail of the zipper tape that we have sticking up. So I'm going to go ahead and go through both of those, but I'm not doing the garment layer, only the facing and the zipper tape. I'll go ahead and get a little closer for y'all. There we go. So just trimming that facing one, which is the one with the interfacing on it, in half. If I can get my scissors in there. So this stitch line that we just did at 1/2 inch right here, it's important that that is nice and clean and an even seam allowance of 1/4 inch. If it's not, that is the seam that determines the shape of your neckline. So if that seam is not even, if you do a larger seam allowance in some areas and more narrow in others, being very noticeable on the outside of your garment. And your neckline is going to look uneven. So make sure that you fix that one before you move on if it was uneven. Trying to make sure I don't cut anything I'm not supposed to. Okay. Now we need to clip this all the way around. So we have, especially here in the back, it's really curved right at that shoulder area. So we're going to do clips pretty close together. Make sure you're using nice sharp shears and just the tip of your shears, and you're going to slit all the way down to that stitch line, but not through it. And that's through both layers. When you get to that V right here, we need to slit right down the center of that V all the way to the point so that it can release that tension. Okay, now we're going to separate these layers. So I've got facing over here and garment over here. I'm going to stick my ham underneath there, and we're going to press these towards that facing side. So all of those, separate those layers, facing and garment as much as you can, and then press those layers towards, those seam allowance layers towards the facing, because we're about to understitch. So these steps should sound familiar. It's the 4 steps that you always do for facings. You trim, clip, press, and then understitch. So whenever I do this part, I'm going to treat this neckline like it's 2 separate parts when I get to this point. So I'm going to understitch this side up to that point, stop and backstitch, and then I'll go to the other side, backstitch, and do the second half of my neckline. Just because trying to understitch it right on that point is really difficult, and it doesn't really benefit us at all. Okay, so I pressed half of my neckline. I'm going to flip around to the other side. Separate those layers. And do the same for this side. Press it towards the facing. Okay, let's go understitch this neckline. Okay, so just like I pressed it, I'm going to keep those layers separate. So facing is over here, garment is over here. We pressed it just like this a second ago. We're gonna keep it separated like this for the understitch. I'm gonna get it a little closer. Okay, so right next to that original stitch line, you can see it right here on that seam allowance side that's pressed towards the facing. We're going to stitch as close as we can get to that original seam line. Okay, I'm all the way to the point here, so I'm going to back stitch, stop, and then I don't really like, you can work from the point out, but I don't prefer it, so I'm going to switch to my other shoulder line. I can get this out from under here. Here we go. So I'm going to just flip my garment around to that other center back and just start on this side and work my way in towards the point again. So again, facing and garment are separated. I'm going to stitch on that side where the facing is, and our seam allowances are pressed to that side. This is just a preference thing where I just, for some reason, I find it more difficult to work from the point out. So I rather work towards the point. At the point, I'm going to back stitch and stop. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board again. Okay, so here we are. We just stitched from this inside area. And on the outside, you should be able to see your little understitch. Mine is white right now, but that little understitch right next to the seam, and it should be on the inside of the dress. This is my facing, so this is the inside. Okay, so I'm going to fold my neckline right on that seam. So now I've got garment here on the outside. I shouldn't be able to see any of the facing sticking out from the outside of the garment. And then on the inside of the garment, I should be able to see that seam right on the edge with the understitching right next to it. And we're going to press that. For now, we're going to leave this zipper sticking off the edge. Next class, we'll talk about attaching this area right here. So for now, we're just going to leave it there. We'll worry about that next class. So I'm going to place this, fold it right on my neckline, place it on my ham, and press that. If you are not asking a question, please make sure you are muted so the camera is not bouncing back and forth. Okay, so we're getting right down to the V here. That V, once it's stitched, should lay nice and flat. I shouldn't have any like tucks or pulls right here. If it's kind of pulling or showing little diagonal creases or anything, it may be a thing where you accidentally stitched a tuck into your fabric, in which case you would need to seam rip and fix that. Or it may just be a clipping issue. If you didn't clip really well at that point, it may not be laying completely flat. So you can go back on the inside and clip your seam allowances a little bit more. But at this point, you should have a nice V point that's laying flat. Okay, so that's our whole neckline stitched. Now we need to do our armholes. Today during class, I'm just going to do one to save time, but you'll do the same process on both, just like you did for your all-in-one facing sample. Okay, so now let me zoom out a little bit so you can see the big picture of what's happening. Okay, so now that we've pressed that neckline, our lining should be, our facings and lining should be sitting on the inside of the garment. You should be looking at the right side of those. And then on the outside of your garment, you've got that right side of your fabric. And right now we just have this opening here between the layers at center back. So that opening is what we're going to use to stick our hand in between and grab our seam allowances for that armhole. So I'm just going to pick this one since it's already on camera, but I'm going to, sorry, just getting everything situated. Okay, I'm going to stick my hand in between those two layers. So this is one side of my back facing and lining. This is my shell. Stick my hand in between. Look for those notches. I happen to be on the back side, so this is a double notch right here. So I'm going to grab right at that double notch, turn my seam allowance in on both sides so that I'm pinching them, and then I can pull it out in between those two layers and start pinning it together. Be careful not to let go of it, because if you accidentally let go of it, trying to find your spot, you would have to just start back over, put everything right side out and go inside and pinch. So that's my double notch, right sides together right there. I'm going to work my way down to that side seam and then also up to that shoulder. So here's my side seam right here. Just pinning those right sides together. We had a lot of good all-in-one facing samples on that notebook that I graded. So that's great. Y'all are doing a good job practicing this. Okay, up to my shoulder seam. And then just matching those up in between. Okay, so from shoulder down to side seam, I'm going to stitch this side and then we'll flip it right side out and we'll match up the other side. So let's go stitch this one at 1/4 inch. Okay, so I'm going to start up at my shoulder area here. I'm going to get my needle down first so it holds my place. There we go. And like I said, all of this over here on the left is going to be all bunched up and crazy, but as long as you've got a flat area right here in front of your foot to stitch, you should be good. And if you need help with this part, with this particular part of the dress, I have office hours tomorrow, 10:30 to, or sorry, 10 to 12:30. And then also this dress isn't due until, I think it's after we get back from Easter. So next week, let me just double check that. You know what? Here, I'll finish this seam and then I'll double check that. But I think we have next week's office hours as well. So if you need help, you could come in and I can help you figure out how to get this together during office hours. I'm making sure that my seams are staying busted open right at this side seam. Make sure I've got a nice flat area in front of my foot. There we go. And then seams are busted open. I'm just going to go right to that side seam and stop. Okay, so we just stitched this area right here on that seam. I'm going to trim up my little threads before I move on. And then we're going to turn this right side out. So right here was my seam. I'm just going to get back to the outside. Here we go. So everything is right side out and I've got my little opening here at center back again. So we're going to use that same opening to do the front part of the seam. So I'm going to put my hand through, and this one I'm going to have to put my hand through under the arm. So this is the armpit area right here. So I'm going like under the arm. My hand is right here. The hole for my shoulder or for my armhole is right here. So I'm going underneath and around to the back to grab it, or around to the front, I guess it is. So go in between, under the arm, and around to the front to grab it. Okay, right at that single notch, I'm going to fold my seam allowance in so I can pinch it, fold my facing seam allowance in so I can pinch it. Okay, and then pull those out. And then I'm just going to keep pulling that seam allowance out and matching it up right sides together. It should be pretty easy at the side seam because you haven't attached your lining yet. So you've got a pretty open area. So on this one, instead of starting from the shoulder and working my way down, I'm going to start from that side seam and work my way up just because I've got an easier open area here. So keep pulling out those side seam or those, sorry, seam allowances and matching them together until you get back up to that shoulder. Trying to pull them out of this tube here. There we go. Okay, let's go stitch this one at a 1/4 inch as well. Okay, so this one, like I said, I'm going to start at that side seam because it's a little bit easier to get to. Let me get it all situated. Okay, so right at that side seam, I'm going to put my needle down right in that back stitch that I ended with. And then I'm going to work my way up to the shoulder. Again, make sure your edges stay even so you don't end up with frayed edges sticking out of your neckline or your armhole. So you can see this little tube here, that's your shoulder. And so sometimes you have to stick your fingers in there and pull out what's inside so that you have a nice flat space to stitch here. So that's what I was talking about whenever I was pulling those seam allowances out of that tube. Okay, and now I'm going to connect right back to that back stitch that I did the first time. Okay, back to our ironing board. Okay, trim up my little threads before I move on. And then I'm going to trim, clip, and press. So since we already have this one pulled out, I'm going to go ahead and trim this one while I'm here. So that facing or that seam allowance on the facing side, we're going to trim in half. That's the one with the interfacing on it. And I'm just going to work my way all the way around this circle, trimming that seam allowance. So you have to pull it out some more. There we go. So you can see more of that seam allowance. Okay. Now clipping. Same thing all the way around. So be very careful as you're clipping not to clip too deep because you don't want to go through. You want it to be all the way down to the stitch line, but not through. And we're clipping through both seam allowances. And these are going to be pretty close together because this is a full circle. So it's a pretty steep curve. So I'm doing them about 1/2 inch apart. So I'm sticking my hand in that shoulder tube and pulling the inside out so I can get to that shoulder seam allowance. area. Okay, I made it all the way around. So now we need to press the seam allowances towards our facing. In order to do that, we have to separate these layers. So this is the seam allowance that we're working on. I'm going to separate those layers. This happens to be my side seam. Like I said, that's going to be the most open area to separate. So that's where I'm going to start and then kind of work my way up to the shoulder on both sides. So put that on your ham with those layers separated. So you can see, I'll go all the way back from beginning on how I did that. So if I turn everything right side out, here's my fully finished armhole. This is the inside of my garment. And I've got that opening at the zipper. So separate these two layers, find that seam allowance at the armhole, and put that on your ham. Okay, and this is, again, my side seam right here. Okay, and we're just going to press those towards our facing. This is that tube right here where my shoulder is. So again, just stick your hand down in there and pull out the insides. I'm going to try and get this maybe on the tip of my ham because it's kind of narrow. There we go. All the way up to, this is my shoulder right here. So I got to get all the way up there. I've got my hand, my ham standing up with the shoulder on the tip of my ham. Okay, so that's one side of the armhole here. I'm going to do the other side. So again, just turn it right side out, and I'm going to go back to my side seam where I started pressing, and I'm going to work my way the other way towards the other shoulder. Just trying to get this situated. There we go. My ham's underneath. And instead of working this way like I did the first time, I'm going to work the other way. If you can't get it on your ham, that one is really tight. I'm not able to get it on my ham. So I'm just going to go ahead and press it flat like this. Just be aware that doing it like that will put wrinkles in whatever fabric's underneath. So you're going to have to do a good job later of pressing out all of those wrinkles. With cotton, wrinkles tend to come out easier if you have the steam or a spray bottle and you can spray that water on it. They tend to release a little easier. Okay, so I'm all the way to the shoulder seam, which was right here. Got that last little bit. My ham was too fat to get up in there. Okay, so now we're going to understitch that whole thing. So I'm gonna go back to my side seam. So again, turn everything right side out. It's always easier just to go back and start from right side out to find where you're at. Okay, so everything is right side out right here. I'm gonna go in between those two layers back to my side seam. And right here, I'm gonna start with these two layers separated at my side seam, and I'm gonna work my way to one shoulder, and then I'll start at the side seam again and work my way to the other shoulder. So it'll be two separate stitch lines. Okay, so we're gonna go put this under our machine at the side seam and work our way up. So separate layers. Here's my lining and facing with my shell over here separated. I'm gonna get to that side seam, stitch on top of my seam allowances, which should be pressed to that facing side with the inner facing on it. Okay. Just getting a nice flat area right here in front of my foot, and then we'll start stitching that under stitch. As you get close, yeah. Is there a question?
Just make sure. So we trim the side with the interfacing on it, right?
Yeah.
Before we
so
stitch.
The seam allowance that you're trimming is the one that has the interfacing on it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. As you get closer into the shoulder, it'll have a smaller area. So this is my tube right here for my shoulder. So I'm gonna have to. It'll be kind of bunched up. But what I'm not paying attention to all the bunches on the side. I'm just paying attention to what's right in front of my foot and making sure that that's flat for me to stitch on. And you'll only be able to go for maybe 2 inches at a time, and then you'll have to adjust your fabric. And just keep flattening it out right there, right in front of the foot. The little seam allowance is popping up. There we go. We're almost there. We've got like 1.5 inches left. There we go. So that's my seam. If you can see it right here under my fingers. Just getting a flat area to stitch on. Okay, and now I've made it up to my shoulder, back stitch, and then pull it out from the machine. So you can see how I've got this whole, it's like a little cave that I'm stitching into. It's all bunched up here, but what matters is what was right in front of my foot. So pull that all out. There we go. And now I'm gonna go back to my side seam again. You may have to flip it around. So my sides flipped, if you'll notice. The facing was on this side when I did that first seam here. So I just flipped it around, so now my facing is on the other side and I can work my way up to the shoulder on this side. So right where that back stitch was, connect my needle. This little red tail that's wrapped around my foot. Let go. Okay, let me get a pin real quick to get that. I don't know if you can see right here on the left side of my foot. I've got a little thread tail that's wrapped around and it's holding my foot in place and it's not letting it go forward. There we go. Untangle that. Now we can go. So this side is typically a little bit easier because you have this big, this is my zipper, so you have this big opening where the zipper is. So this side is typically a little bit easier to get to that shoulder. You don't have as much bunching. Okay, all the way up to that shoulder. And then we're done with that step. Okay, head back to our ironing board. Okay, over here, I want to make sure I look on the inside of my dress and trim up any thread tails I have before I move on. Same thing on the outside if you have any tails hanging off. Okay, and then we're just going to press that armhole. Oh, there are my tails. I knew they were somewhere. Press that armhole just like we did the neckline. So the seam. So once I get everything turned right side out, here is my finished armhole. And I just need to stick my ham in there and press. So it should be big enough to where you can kind of get your ham in there. Make sure that seam is right on the edge. And then press that nice crease to where your facing should not be sticking out from the front at all. If you have any little, so you can see I have little frayed edges. That's just from where my fabric was raveling and it got stuck in the seam. Make sure to clean that sort of stuff up too. Okay, once that's done, you're going to do the same thing. So that's my nice pressed armhole there, really nice and clean from the front, from the outside of the garment. I should only be able to see the shell. From the inside of the garment, I should be able to see the seam and the understitching as close to the edge as possible. Okay, so this is right now the outside of my dress. From the front, you're going to do the same process. I did this armhole here. You're going to do the same process to the other armhole. And then next time we come together, we'll talk about closing this opening that's here at center back. Okay, but you need to get your armholes stitched before we close this up.